When 12 stranded bikers entered a widow's garage, they expected warmth, not their own names engraved in steel. 32 years ago, 12 of us nearly disappeared on this mountain, Warren said. Then Eleanor realized the hidden workshop stood directly in the path of a demolition permit. A debt does not give us ownership, he told her, but it does not stop us from finding the truth. Get those motorcycles inside before the batteries die and the wet controls ice over. At 6:47 p.m., Eleanor Vance stood beneath the yellow garage light in a gray wool coat, one hand gripping the metal door chain, while 12 motorcycle headlights flickered across Cedar Run Pass. Snow had already covered the road markers. The temperature had fallen to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was driving ice against the windows like handfuls of dry rice. She had lived alone on that mountain for 2 winters, but she had never seen 12 lights disappear one by one. The 12 men were retracing the Carson Ridge Memorial route on the 32nd anniversary of the storm that had nearly ended their lives. Then the last one went dark. Eleanor stepped into snow deep enough to reach the tops of her rubber boots. She could taste salt from the stew she had sampled minutes earlier, mixed now with the cold metallic bite of the wind. 90 yards from the house, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard was trying to lift a black 2014 Harley-Davidson Road King, whose rear tire had buried itself in a frozen rut. 2 other men were pushing a 2008 Street Glide uphill, while an older rider sat against a guardrail, his gloved hands shaking too hard to close. Their leather vests carried the colors of the fictional Iron Saris Motorcycle Club, but the men were not advancing like a threat. They were losing ground. "Garage," Eleanor called. "All 12 bikes. Move." The gray-bearded man stared at her through the snow. A pale scar ran from his left temple to his cheek, and ice clung to his beard. "Ma'am, there are 12 of us. I can count." That ended the discussion. Warren Gravel-Keen ordered the men into 2 lines, keeping their voices low as they pushed nearly $230,000 worth of motorcycles toward the house. Eleanor opened the garage to its full 16-foot width. The room smelled of engine oil, cedar shavings, old coffee, and the faint syrupy sweetness of the propylene glycol antifreeze Samuel had used in the heating system. Along the rear wall stood a 1972 Craftsman tool chest, a hydraulic lift, and 3 covered workbenches that had not been touched since her husband's funeral 14 months earlier. A locked wooden partition occupied the far corner. Warren noticed it immediately. Eleanor noticed him noticing it. By 7:18 p.m., every motorcycle was inside. Snow melted from tires onto the sloped concrete floor, forming black-edged pools beneath chrome exhaust pipes. Eleanor closed the door, dropped the steel latch, and faced the men. The youngest looked about 54. The oldest, Amos Riverdale, was 70 and had a pale burn scar climbing the right side of his neck. They looked rough enough to frighten most people, yet 3 of them had removed their wet gloves to help the trembling rider without being asked. Eleanor pointed toward the mudroom. "Dry clothes are in the cabinet. Soup is on the stove. Nobody touches the red switch beside the furnace." Curtis Hollow Brand, a thick-armed man with a scar across one eyebrow, glanced toward the locked partition. "And what is behind that wall?" Warren turned his head before Eleanor answered. "Not our business." Eleanor studied him for a moment. "3 rules," she said. "No fighting, no wandering through my house, and no one opens that room." Warren nodded once. "Understood." The generator coughed inside its vented exterior enclosure at 7:31 p.m., causing the garage lights to dim. Amos moved toward it, but Warren stopped beside the old tool chest. His expression changed. Burned into its lower drawer was a small welding mark, 2 narrow V-shapes crossing at the center. Warren touched the scar on his cheek. Outside, the storm erased the road. Inside, Eleanor watched a stranger recognize a symbol her husband had never explained. At 7:36 p.m., Eleanor set 12 mismatched bowls along the kitchen counter and filled them with beef and barley soup that tasted of black pepper, roasted onion, and a last spoonful of tomato paste from a 69-cent can. Several men changed into Samuel's old flannel shirts and thermal pants, while the others wrapped themselves in spare blankets and dry towels, leaving their leather vests hanging from nails beside the mudroom door. Curtis remained near the hallway, studying the framed photographs, the locked partition beyond the garage, and Eleanor with the same guarded attention. "You always keep enough food for 12 strangers?" he asked. "I keep enough for a closed mountain," Eleanor replied. Warren took the bowl from her and passed it to the rider whose hands had been shaking beside the guardrail. His name was Dean Marlowe Price, 56, and the fingertips of his right hand had turned waxy white beneath his gloves. After confirming that Dean would not be exposed to the cold again, Eleanor placed his hand in water reading 100 degrees on her kitchen thermometer, then wrapped it in a clean cotton towel. "No rubbing," she said, "and no direct heat." Dean looked toward Warren. Warren nodded. They listened. At 7:44, the generator coughed twice, released a ribbon of blue exhaust, and dropped the garage lights to half strength. Amos put down his soup and crossed the concrete floor with the stiff, careful walk of a man whose knees had spent 50 winters beside engines. He opened the side panel, leaned close, and smelled the air. "Fuel," he said. A cracked return line was leaking diesel onto the base plate, less than 8 inches from the exhaust housing. Amos immediately shut down the generator and closed the fuel valve. After the housing had cooled and the spilled diesel had been wiped away, he removed the damaged section of return hose, trimmed it with Samuel's utility knife, and secured the new connection with 2 stainless clamps from the 1972 Craftsman chest. The repair cost less than $3. It kept the entire building warm. By 8:02, the temperature inside the garage had climbed from 41 degrees to 54, while the outdoor thermometer beside the kitchen window had fallen to 6. Wind pressed against the north wall in steady 38-mile-per-hour gusts, bending the bare spruce trees until their upper branches scraped the roof. 2 bikers carried sandbags from the storage shed and braced the lower edge of the garage door. 3 more cleared snow from the furnace vent with a grain shovel and an aluminum serving tray when the second shovel snapped. Curtis found a loose hinge on the mudroom door and tightened it without asking. Eleanor noticed. She said nothing. At 8:19, every phone in the room lost service except Eleanor's landline. It rang once. The name on the small green display read Malcolm Rusk. She answered in the pantry, but the old swinging door did not close completely. Malcolm's voice came through thin and controlled. Blackridge Development had already paid $18,600 for the preliminary survey. Their survey crew would return at 9 a.m. on the first morning Cedar Run Pass reopened, while the demolition permit would become effective after the 7-day response period. The garage, he reminded her, stood inside the proposed access corridor, and her final response period would expire in 7 days. "The weather has not changed my answer," Eleanor said. "Weather changes schedules, Mrs. Vance. It has not changed contracts." Warren stood 6 feet away, holding an empty soup bowl. He heard every word. Eleanor replaced the receiver and found him watching the cracked pantry door. "How long have they been trying to take this place?" he asked. "They are not taking it." "That was not my question." "Then you do not need an answer." Warren lowered his eyes and stepped aside. At 8:33, a spruce trunk split somewhere above the house with a sharp wooden crack. Seconds later, the telephone line went silent, and a heavy branch crashed across the driveway, blocking the only visible route downhill. Nobody could leave now. At 8:41, the men returned to the garage to check the motorcycles and spread absorbent pads beneath the engines. Dean's fingers had regained color, though he still could not close his hand fully. Eleanor counted the riders, checked the generator gauge, and looked toward the wooden partition. A deep metallic impact came from behind it. Every man stopped moving. Then something heavy rolled across the hidden floor and struck the wall from the other side. At 8:42 p.m., Curtis stepped toward the wooden partition, but Eleanor moved between him and a locked door before he crossed half the garage. "You open that room. You leave my house," she said. "There is nowhere to leave," Curtis replied, glancing toward the snow-packed garage door. Warren crossed the floor and placed one hand against Curtis's chest. "Then staying becomes simple," he said. "We follow her rules." The metallic object behind the wall shifted again, slower this time, followed by the scrape of something heavy rolling across concrete. Dean remained seated near the heater with his right hand wrapped in a cotton towel. Amos lifted a flashlight from the workbench and examined the ceiling above the partition. A hairline crack ran through the drywall beside a steel support bracket. Fine sawdust had collected on the floor beneath it. That was not someone moving around, Amos said. Something inside broke loose. Eleanor kept the brass key to the hidden room inside the pocket of her gray coat. She could feel its 3 square teeth pressing against her palm. The room stays closed. Amos pointed toward the northern corner of the ceiling. How old is this roof? Samuel rebuilt that section in 2009 with 6x8 beams, Douglas fir. Amos looked at the ceiling again. Then it was built well. That does not mean it can safely hold 3 feet of dense, wind-packed snow. At 8:49, Warren and Amos opened the side service door only 8 inches before wind forced it back against them. Snow had climbed above the lower hinge, and the north roofline sagged nearly 2 inches over the hidden room. Amos estimated the load at more than 30 pounds per square foot. The section above the main garage was shedding snow because of the furnace heat. The roof over the locked room was not. We need to brace it from inside, he said. You can brace the wall from this side, Eleanor answered. Not without seeing where the joists land. Curtis folded his arms. Whatever is in there may be under the roof by morning. Eleanor looked at Warren. He did not argue for the key. Your room, he said. Your decision. That restraint unsettled her more than pressure would have. At 9:03, Eleanor allowed Amos to remove 3 cedar boards from the outer face of the partition, no higher than shoulder level and no wider than 24 inches. The door remained locked. 2 bikers rolled Samuel's 12-ton bottle jack from beneath the hydraulic lift, while another cut a temporary brace from a 12-foot length of pine stored above Samuel's workbench. The fresh wood smelled sharp and clean against the heavier odors of diesel, wet leather, and cooling exhaust. Amos placed the brace beneath a roof beam and eased it upward by less than half an inch. The ceiling crack stopped widening. Then his flashlight caught the steel frame inside the wall. 2 narrow V-shapes had been welded across the lower joint. He stared at them for several seconds. Samuel made this partition? He asked. Samuel made almost everything in this garage. Where did he work before he came up here? Eleanor's expression hardened. He repaired logging equipment, snowplows, and farm machinery. He was a mechanic. That is not ordinary shop welding. He was not an ordinary mechanic. Warren watched Amos, but said nothing. Curtis noticed the exchange. You two recognize that mark. I recognize careful work, Amos replied. It was not a complete answer. At 9:17, the wind shifted northwest. The pressure against the building changed, and the temperature dropped to 4 degrees. A copper pipe running above the locked room gave a sudden shudder. Eleanor looked up just as the fitting beside the wall split. Water sprayed across the ceiling, struck the electrical conduit, and poured behind the cedar boards. The breaker panel flickered once. Amos reached for the red furnace switch, while Warren pulled Dean and 2 motorcycles away from the spreading water. Main valve, Amos called. Eleanor shut it beneath the utility sink, but nearly 7 gallons had already vanished behind the wall. The smell of wet insulation filled the garage. A thin stream began leaking from beneath the locked door, carrying gray dust and a dark curl of machine oil. Amos removed the lower board and aimed his flashlight through the gap. The low-mounted equipment junction box is taking water, he said. If we do not open that wall, we lose the furnace, the generator feed, and every light in this building. Eleanor looked at the brass key in her hand. Behind the partition, another heavy object shifted toward the flooded corner. This time, something small and metal rolled through the water and stopped against the door. It rang once like a tiny bell. At 9:24 p.m., Eleanor inserted the brass key into the lock, but it would not turn. The swollen wood had pressed the door against its frame, and water was already reaching the bottom of the electrical box behind the wall. Amos shut down the generator feed, while Warren moved 2 motorcycles another 6 feet from the spreading stream. Curtis wedged a flat pry bar beneath the door, then stopped and looked at Eleanor. Your call. She nodded once. The lock released on the second pull. Cold air rolled from the hidden room, carrying the smell of machine oil, wet canvas, rust, old rubber tubing, and traces of dried antiseptic. Warren raised his flashlight. Nobody spoke. The room was nearly 22 feet deep, larger than the kitchen, with shelves covering both side walls and a steel work table bolted to the floor. 12 wooden crates stood beneath the shelves, each marked with a date and a surname in Samuel's square handwriting. At the center sat a motorcycle under a dark green canvas cover. A narrow sidecar frame extended from its right side, and the object that had rolled across the floor rested against one wheel. It was a small brass bell. Eleanor stepped inside first. The falling rack had tipped a shallow tray, sending the brass bell rolling nearly 11 feet across the wet concrete. She picked it up, wiped the darkened metal with her sleeve, and stared at a shallow dent near the rim. Warren's face lost color. "Where did he get that?" he asked. Eleanor closed her fingers around the bell. "It belonged to Samuel." "Since when?" "Longer than I knew him." Amos entered next, careful not to disturb the cables running along the floor. With the circuit fully isolated, Amos removed the wet conductors from the flooded box and capped the dry ends inside rated waterproof connectors. Curtis and 2 others lifted a fallen steel rack that had caused the first impact. Behind it, a row of polished metal plates leaned against the wall. Each was 6 inches long, unfinished at the edges, and engraved with a name. Warren Keene, Amos Dale, Curtis Brand, Dean Price. 8 more. Curtis read his own name twice. "I never knew the man who saved us was your husband." "None of us did," Dean said from the doorway. Eleanor looked from one plate to the next. "Then why are your names in his workshop?" Warren did not answer. He walked toward the covered motorcycle and stopped 3 feet away, as though crossing the remaining distance required permission. Eleanor pulled the canvas free. Beneath it stood a partially restored 1949 Harley-Davidson Panhead, its black frame mounted on a service stand and its fuel tank painted a deep, unfinished red. The original 61 cubic inch engine had been rebuilt, but the motorcycle was no longer configured for ordinary travel. Samuel had added a reinforced sidecar with a padded stretcher platform, brackets for 2 oxygen cylinders, insulated storage boxes, and a folding windshield thick enough for mountain weather. A faded paper tag tied to the handlebar read Mercy Bell, Unit 1. Amos moved closer to the weld, joining the sidecar brace to the frame. 2 narrow V-shapes crossed at the center. He touched the metal with one scarred finger. "Same hand," he said. Eleanor turned toward him. "Same as what?" Amos looked at Warren. Warren kept his eyes on the brass bell in Eleanor's hand. At 9:39, the lights flickered back on after Amos bypassed the flooded circuit. Full illumination revealed a wall map of Cedar Run Pass covered with red pencil marks, 12 numbered routes, and dates stretching back 32 years. Beside it hung photographs of damaged cars, snowbound trucks, and strangers standing outside the garage wrapped in Samuel's old blankets. Eleanor recognized only 2 of them, far fewer than the records suggested Samuel had helped. Curtis opened the nearest crate without lifting anything from it. Inside were heated gloves, signal flares, wool blankets, medical splints, and a handwritten label reading price. Right hand cold exposure. Dean stared at the words. He knew. About my hand before tonight. Warren finally stepped forward. Not tonight's injury. Eleanor faced him. Then explain it. Warren looked at the bell, the V-shaped weld, and the name Samuel had preserved in steel. 32 years ago, he said, 12 of us nearly disappeared on this mountain. Warren kept his eyes on the unfinished motorcycle as the storm pressed against the garage walls. February 18th, 1994, he said. We were riding north after a memorial in Carson Ridge. The forecast called for light snow, but by 5:20 p.m., we could not see 10 feet ahead. Amos lowered himself onto a wooden crate. Dean remained near the heater, his recovering hand resting against his chest. Curtis stood beside the steel plates, staring at his engraved name. Warren explained that all 12 riders had been between 22 and 38 years old in 1994. Curtis, the youngest, had been 23. 3 motorcycles had slid on black ice near mile marker 61. A fuel tank split, one rider fractured his leg, and Dean lost feeling in his right hand after digging through snow with a bare glove. We had one working flashlight, Amos said. Half a thermos of coffee. It tasted like burnt pennies. The temperature had fallen below zero before a single yellow light appeared through the storm. A man driving a homemade, tracked motorcycle emerged from the snow with a brass bell fixed beside the handlebar. He wore a canvas mechanic's coat, welding goggles, and a red scarf pulled across his face. Over the next 4 hours, he transported the injured riders down the mountain in pairs, using a narrow metal sled attached behind his machine. He delivered them to an abandoned highway maintenance shelter 2 miles below the crash site, which was why none of them had ever seen his garage. He heated broth on a camping stove, wrapped Dean's hand in wool, and used a broken wooden snow marker slat as a temporary splint. He refused the $640 the riders collected for him. He waved off introductions until every injury had been stabilized. Only then did he record each rider's name in a small black notebook. He never told us who he was, Warren said. He only said the mountain did not care what patch we wore. Eleanor gripped the brass bell until its dent pressed into her palm. Samuel had repeated a version of that sentence whenever stranded drivers knocked on their door, but she had never asked where it came from. Amos pointed toward the V-shaped weld on the sidecar brace. That mark was on the machine that carried us down. Eleanor crossed to the steel work table. Beneath a stack of weather maps, she found a black notebook swollen from dampness. The first pages listed tire sizes, fuel mixtures, road temperatures, and mile markers. Farther inside, Samuel had recorded names: Warren Keene, Amos Dale, Curtis Brand, Dean Price. 8 others followed. Next to each name was an injury, a route number, and a short note about equipment still needed. Eleanor turned pages faster. Receipts had been folded between them. For $1,280 for the damaged panhead frame, $1,760 for medical brackets, $935 for 2 used oxygen tanks, and $6,400 withdrawn from a joint savings account 11 months before Samuel died. Another $4,043 in wiring, steel, medical storage, and fabrication supplies brought the documented total to $17,418. She recognized every account number. She recognized none of the purchases. He told me the roof repairs cost that money, she said. No one defended him. Warren removed his cap and set it on the workbench. What he did for us was good, he said. What he hid from you was still hidden. Eleanor looked at the motorcycle Samuel had built in secret, then at 12 men carrying a history she had never been allowed to share. For 14 months, she had protected the lock partition because Samuel had spent his final weeks working behind it, and she had never made herself turn the key. Now it felt like evidence from a marriage she had understood only in part. At 10:07 p.m., the garage temperature reached 59 degrees. Amos finished drying the electrical box while Curtis lifted the remaining crates above the waterline. Warren did not approach Eleanor again. He waited. She opened the final page of the notebook and found a penciled sentence beneath a parts estimate dated 6 days before Samuel's death. Mercy. Bell must be ready before next winter. Under it was a county parcel number matching the property documents Malcolm Rusk had mailed that week. Eleanor returned to the kitchen and retrieved the certified envelope from a drawer. The notice stated that Blackridge had received conditional county approval to activate a dormant service road easement crossing the northern edge of the Vance parcel. Because part of the garage extended into that recorded corridor, the demolition permit would become effective 7 days after the pass reopened unless Eleanor filed an administrative challenge. Warren read the first page, then placed it back on the table. Tell us what you want done. Eleanor looked at the 12 names fixed in steel. Tonight, she said, I want the roof to hold. By 6:12 the next morning, the wind had weakened to 20 miles per hour, but Cedar Run Pass remained buried beneath nearly 40 inches of snow. The temporary roof braces had held. The furnace was running at 62 degrees. Every motorcycle remained upright. Eleanor stood beside Mercy Bell with a mug of coffee that tasted bitter, smoky, and slightly metallic from sitting too long in Samuel's dented steel pot. She had slept for less than 90 minutes. Curtis entered carrying a roofing shovel and pointed toward the hidden workshop. We can put 6 bikes across the access road when Blackridge comes. They will not move anything. Eleanor set down her mug. No, they would turn around and return with photographs showing 12 bikers blocking private contractors. Curtis looked toward the demolition notice. So we let them take it? Warren stepped between them before Eleanor needed to answer. A debt does not give us ownership, he said. Samuel helped us. That does not make this garage ours, and it does not make her decision ours. Curtis's jaw tightened. He glanced at the 12 steel nameplates, then lowered the shovel. Then what are we supposed to do? Ask. Warren faced Eleanor. May we look for records that prove this workshop served the mountain? Eleanor studied the men gathered around Samuel's workbench. Their size could have filled the room with pressure. Instead, they waited. No threats, she said. No one contacts Malcolm using my name. No one posts photographs of this room. Warren nodded. Your rules. At 7:05, the work divided itself. Amos inspected Mercy Bell's fuel system and found a cracked intake seal, a seized rear brake cylinder, and a wiring harness Samuel had labeled 70% complete. Curtis and 2 others climbed onto the lower roof with safety lines and removed what Amos estimated to be between 6,000 and 8,000 pounds of packed snow. Dean cataloged the 12 crates using a yellow legal pad. Warren sat with Eleanor at the steel table and sorted 32 years of receipts, maps, and handwritten rescue notes. One document stood apart. It was a faded county form dated December 3rd, 2001, listing Samuel's garage in the county's voluntary winter assistance register. The form carried a parcel number, a supervisor's signature, and a handwritten notation authorizing reimbursement for up to 120 gallons of documented emergency fuel each winter. Eleanor read it twice. Malcolm's application calls this an abandoned storage structure. Warren placed the Blackridge survey beside the county form. The parcel numbers matched. The descriptions did not. At 9:18, a highway plow reached the lower switchback, restoring limited radio reception. One biker contacted a retired county clerk he knew from a charity ride and asked only where historical road service records were stored. Another called the small diner at the base of the pass and learned that 3 older residents still remembered Samuel opening the garage during winter closures. Nobody mentioned Blackridge. Nobody promised an outcome. By noon, the men had recovered 6 fuel vouchers and 9 dated photographs from Samuel's filing cabinet. The official 2007 roadmap would have to be located and authenticated at the county archive. Eleanor still refused to call a victory. Old papers disappear when new money arrives, she said. Then we make copies, Warren replied. Amos emerged from the workshop, wiping black grease from his fingers. The panhead can run again. Not today. The engine needs 8 hours, the brake system needs parts, and the sidecar mount needs testing. He looked at Eleanor rather than Warren. But it is your machine. You decide whether it runs. That afternoon, Curtis repaired the garage roof where the copper pipe had split, using $32 of flashing and a tube of sealant from Samuel's cabinet. He did not mention blocking the road again. At 3:26 p.m., the snowplow cleared a narrow lane to the house. A black sport utility vehicle appeared behind it. Malcolm Rusk stepped out in a navy overcoat and polished shoes, carrying a leather document case. He stopped when he saw 12 motorcycles lined beneath the garage lights. Eleanor walked outside alone. Warren raised one hand, keeping every biker behind her. Malcolm looked past Eleanor toward the hidden workshop, now visible through the open partition. Mrs. Vance, he said, it appears your property has developed a security problem. Eleanor held the county assistance form against her coat. No, she answered. It appears your survey has developed a records problem. Malcolm's polished shoes sank nearly 2 inches into the slush beside the driveway, but his expression remained composed. He opened the leather case, removed a survey map, and held it beneath the pale afternoon light. This corridor was approved based on the registered use of the structure, he said. Storage, private repair, no public function. Eleanor handed him the county assistance form. Your description is incomplete. Malcolm read the signature, the parcel number, and the authorization for 120 gallons of emergency fuel. He did not return the page immediately. A 25-year-old volunteer designation does not automatically restrict development. Then you will not object to the county reviewing it. Behind Eleanor, 12 men stood inside the garage without speaking. Warren had ordered every leather vest removed from sight. Curtis kept both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, though the cardboard had softened beneath his grip. Malcolm looked past them toward Mercy Bell, the engraved steel plates, and the wall map marked with rescue routes. "Mrs. Vance, these men may believe their presence helps you," he said. "It may have the opposite effect. A contractor could reasonably consider this an unsafe work site." Curtis took one step forward. Warren raised 2 fingers. Curtis stopped. Eleanor noticed Malcolm notice. "No contractor has entered my property," she said. "No one has threatened one. I am requesting a formal review before demolition." Malcolm replaced the county form inside Eleanor's folder. The notice period expires in 6 days. Personal notebooks and old photographs are not title restrictions. Warren spoke from behind her. "Would sworn testimony about the garage's emergency use be considered personal?" Malcolm turned. "Who are you?" "A man who was rescued on this pass after a mountain accident in 1994. "By Mr. Vance?" "That is what the records appear to show." Malcolm closed his document case. "Appearances are not evidence." "Then we will use evidence," Eleanor said. At 3:41 p.m., Malcolm returned to his vehicle and drove downhill behind the plow without entering the garage. Once the pass reopened, 8 riders checked into the Pine Hollow Motor Lodge, while Warren, Amos, Curtis, and Dean returned to the garage each morning with food and tools. No biker followed him. No one raised a voice. The silence bothered Curtis more than an argument would have. "He thinks paper beats people," he said. Warren collected the empty coffee cups. "Then bring better paper." At 4:10, Eleanor called the county planning office from the restored landline and requested an emergency administrative review. The clerk gave her a hearing date 5 days away and warned that supporting documents had to be submitted by noon the previous day. That left less than 92 hours. The next morning, the riders separated into teams. Warren and Dean visited the county archive in Pine Hollow, where records were stored in a basement that smelled of dust, floor wax, and overheated copier toner. Amos remained with Eleanor, replacing Mercy Bell's corroded brake lines and photographing every rescue modification before touching it. Curtis drove to the diner below the pass and located 2 retired snowplow operators who remembered receiving coffee, fuel, and shelter from Samuel during the winters of 2003 and 2007. By 6:30 p.m., the group had collected 12 photographs, 6 fuel vouchers for signed statements, and a maintenance invoice showing the county had paid Samuel $286.40 to keep an emergency generator operational. The strongest record appeared on the 3rd day. A faded road service map from 2007 marked the Vance garage with a blue triangle and the words Winter Assistance, Voluntary Site. The map had been distributed to county plow crews, fire dispatchers, and highway maintenance supervisors. Eleanor placed it beside Blackridge's demolition application. The application described the same building as in use since 2018. Samuel was helping. "People after 2018, she said. Amos wiped grease from his hands. "Can you prove it?" Eleanor opened the black notebook to entries dated January 2020, December 2021, and March 2022. Each listed a stranded driver, road conditions, fuel used, and the time that person left safely. Warren added nothing. The facts were enough. At 11:48 a.m. on the 4th day, Eleanor submitted a 73-page evidence packet to the planning office. 12 minutes remained before the deadline. Malcolm filed a response that afternoon, arguing that temporary assistance did not create a permanent public use. He also attached photographs of the motorcycles outside Eleanor's garage, suggesting the property had become a gathering point likely to disrupt future construction. Warren studied the photographs, then looked at the others. "He expects us to become the argument." The next morning, he told every rider to leave his colors inside the locked motel rooms. At 8:55 a.m., 12 scarred men entered the county meeting room in plain shirts and work jackets. They took the last row. Eleanor sat alone at the front table while Malcolm arranged his documents across from her. At 9:03 a.m., the county planning chair called the meeting to order beneath fluorescent lights that made every document look pale and every face look tired. Eleanor sat with her 73-page evidence packet, Samuel's black notebook, and the 2007 road service map arranged in 3 straight stacks. Malcolm Rusk sat opposite her with 2 binders, a tablet, and a projected rendering of Blackridge Development's proposed mountain resort access road. 12 men occupied the final row in plain shirts, denim jackets, and work boots. No colors, no signs, no interruptions. Malcolm spoke first. He described the garage as a deteriorating private structure located inside a corridor designed to reduce emergency response times to the proposed resort by 11 minutes. Blackridge had invested $18,600 in surveys, $41,200 in engineering work, and nearly $96,000 in preliminary access planning. He displayed photographs of 12 motorcycles outside Eleanor's house. Recent activity also raises questions about whether the site can be managed safely during construction, he said. The chair looked toward the back row. Warren did not move. Curtis kept his hands open on his knees. Eleanor waited until Malcolm finished. Then she stood. Those men were stranded during a storm, she said. The garage sheltered them because that is what the garage has done for more than 20 years. She presented the voluntary winter assistance designation, 6 county fuel vouchers, and the generator maintenance invoice for $286.40. Malcolm argued that temporary humanitarian use did not create a protected public facility. Eleanor agreed. I am not claiming the county owns it. I am claiming your application described it incorrectly. The difference changed the room. At 9:31, the county archivist confirmed that Blackridge's demolition request identified the garage as in used private storage since 2018. She then authenticated the 2007 map, marking the same parcel as a winter assistance site distributed to plow crews and dispatch personnel. 3 of Samuel's rescue entries were dated after 2018. Malcolm asked whether handwritten notebooks could be verified. Warren rose only after the chair called his name. He stated his age, 63, and described the February 1994 storm without mentioning loyalty, brotherhood, or debt. He identified the brass bell, the double V welding mark, and the scar on his cheek from the original crash. Amos testified next. He explained that Mercy Bell's reinforced sidecar, stretcher brackets, heated storage compartments, and oxygen mounts served a rescue function rather than recreational use. This is not a display motorcycle, he said. It is unfinished emergency equipment. Curtis was not called. He remained seated. At 10:08, Malcolm returned to the question of safety. He suggested the garage's association with a motorcycle group could create public concern and interfere with construction access. The chair asked whether any rider had threatened a contractor, blocked a road, or entered county property without permission. Malcolm could provide no incident report. Eleanor looked back once. 12 men were still sitting where Warren had placed them. At 10:19, a retired snowplow operator confirmed that Samuel had provided fuel, hot food, and heated shelter during a 2003 closure. Another witness described spending 6 hours in the garage after his truck lost a wheel in 2021. The county's legal advisor cited Section 8.14, which required a supplemental use review before demolishing any structure listed in the Historical Winter Response Register. Because Blackridge had omitted that status from its application, the permit was procedurally defective. At 10:47, the 3-member panel voted to suspend the demolition permit pending a new site assessment, a historical use review, and an evaluation of the garage as a voluntary winter shelter. The decision did not permanently stop the development. It did not grant Eleanor money. It did not guarantee the garage would survive every future application. It stopped the demolition for now. Malcolm closed his binders without looking toward the last row. No one applauded. Outside the meeting room, Eleanor found Warren beside a vending machine, holding a 50-cent paper cup of coffee. "Did Samuel build that motorcycle for you?" she asked. Warren shook his head. "No." He looked through the glass doors toward Cedar Run Pass. "He built it for whoever gets stranded next." 3 months after the hearing, Blackridge Development submitted a revised access plan that shifted the road 140 feet east of Eleanor's property. The redesign added $27,800 in engineering fees and nearly $280,000 to the projected construction cost, but it removed the garage from the demolition corridor and preserved the county's right to review the site as a winter assistance point. Malcolm Rusk did not apologize. Eleanor did not ask him to. She signed a voluntary shelter agreement that kept the building under her ownership, allowed stranded adults to receive temporary warmth and mechanical help, and gave her the right to close the garage whenever conditions became unsafe. The county contributed $3,600 toward a new generator, while a local road safety fund covered insulated doors and 2 emergency heaters. Nothing became easy overnight. Property taxes still arrived. The roof still needed another $4,900 in repairs. Mercy Bell had new brake lines, but its seized rear wheel cylinders still had to be rebuilt. Its sidecar mount had not been load tested, and half of its electrical system remained unfinished. The 12 bikers did not move into Eleanor's life or appear every morning like a permanent rescue crew. They returned when they said they would. Amos came every second Saturday with labeled parts and a thermos of coffee that tasted strongly of cinnamon. Curtis replaced the damaged roof flashing, rebuilt the partition door, and never again asked what Eleanor intended to keep private. Dean installed a heated cabinet for gloves and blankets, using his restored right hand to tighten the final screws. Warren handled the paperwork for a small Mountain Road grant, but every form remained in Eleanor's name. By early November, the 1949 Panhead engine turned over for the first time in years. The unfinished red fuel tank remained scratched near the left seam because Eleanor refused to hide every mark Samuel had left behind. She mounted the 12 engraved steel plates inside the sidecar compartment rather than on the outside. They were not trophies. They were a record of why the machine existed. Over the next 8 months, Eleanor completed the county's volunteer roadside response course, logged 20 supervised hours on Mercy Bell with Amos, and registered the motorcycle as a limited-use winter support vehicle. On December 14th, at 5:52 p.m., the county dispatcher called to report a 68-year-old delivery driver stranded near mile marker 64 with a failed alternator and no cabin heat. Snow was falling at 2 inches per hour. Eleanor opened the garage, tested the radio, checked the first aid kit, and loaded 2 wool blankets and a steel flask of broth before fastening the brass bell beside the handlebar. A county plow escorted Mercy Bell toward mile marker 64 at no more than 12 miles per hour. Eleanor drove on a studded front tire and a chain-equipped rear wheel, while Amos monitored the radio and rescue equipment from the sidecar. They found the driver conscious but shivering inside his van. Eleanor wrapped him in blankets, gave him warm broth from a steel flask, and brought him back to the garage until the road crew arrived. The rescue took 1 hour and 43 minutes. No cameras guatif. No newspaper called. That was exactly how Eleanor wanted it. The following spring, the 12 bikers gathered outside the garage before beginning their annual ride. Warren attached the repaired brass bell to its permanent bracket and pulled the cord once. Each man placed one hand on Mercy Bell's fuel tank before walking back to his motorcycle. Eleanor finally understood what they had found behind the hidden wall. It was not simply a rare motorcycle, a collection of names, or proof that Samuel had lived a secret life. It was an unfinished promise connecting 12 men who had once been rescued to every stranger who might need shelter next. Discovering it changed the future of the garage, stopped Eleanor from losing the last working part of Samuel's legacy, and transformed the bikers from unexpected guests into disciplined partners who helped without taking control. As their engines disappeared down Cedar Run Pass, the wind entered through the open door and moved the small brass bell. The garage was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. If you believe in the true brotherhood and kindness of bikers, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. All characters, organizations, places, and events depicted are fictional.